My name is Kuba Snopek. I was trained as a planner, but in my professional life, I have been most interested in exploring the intersection of art and the built environment. I've written a popular book about the relationship between the Moscow conceptual art and modern architecture. I've also created an award-winning performance art space in Ukraine. Today, I will speak about real estate art. This term doesn't really exist, but I argue it should. Real estate developers are required to pay for public art by percent for art ordinances. Their cumulative contribution of billions of dollars puts developers in line with the biggest art patrons in America. But percent for art regulations don't exist in a vacuum. Local governments keep introducing them because there is a shared belief amongst many developers, mayors, and scholars that in a post-industrial city, investing in arts will foster economic growth, create jobs, and build wealth. This thinking has been reflected by massive investments in spaces between buildings. According to the current narrative, more compelling public spaces will activate ground floor retail, boosting consumption in shops and restaurants. This vibrant atmosphere will, in turn, attract creative professionals. Real estate art has been an important component of this creative urbanism. Big sculptures, often referred to as anchor objects, are believed to increase foot traffic and drive retail sales. But this growth is not for everyone. In the Bay Area, while all these investments in arts were taking place, the artistic community has suffered massive displacement. Take the case of Karen Cusolito, a sculptor from Oakland. For years, she's been developing Oakland's American steel warehouses into a shared makerspace, which, at its peak, served a diverse community of 200 local artists. Eventually, as the property was sold to a development firm from outside California, the artists were asked to vacate the building. Losing their beloved working environment, many of them, including Karen, were disillusioned and decided to leave the Bay Area. Meanwhile, Oakland introduced the Percent for Art ordinance. Ironically, today Karen is working on a sculpture for Central Oakland, funded by the ordinance, while living 70 miles away. This is not an isolated case. The more the developers invest in arts, the fewer artists are there to stay. Living artists are literally being replaced by statues they themselves create. This paradox is a symptom of a more general flaw of the creative urbanism, where developers give disproportionately much attention to the spectacle of the streets as compared to the needs of everyday lives of their tenants. By no means do I suggest that percent for art ordinances should be abolished. On the contrary, the developers should embrace art to transform their neighborhoods, but they should be doing it more intentionally and critically than today. The first percent for art ordinance in the US was introduced in the 1960s. Since then, both the American cities and arts have evolved a great deal. Imagine using a 1960s framework to design apartments, offices, or retail centers. That's what's being done with art. Percent for art programs exist on state and municipal levels all over the US. They differ in details, but all have a common basis. Developers are required to pay a small percentage of the construction costs for publicly available art. The money is paid once, up front, which favors singular objects over recurring events of any kind. Along with the sizes of such budgets, typically on the level of hundreds of thousands of dollars, it makes percent for art ordinances perfectly tailored to fund monumental sculptures. For decades, large sculptures have diversified the landscapes of modern cities. They were also good for marketing. Manicured public spaces populated with beautiful people, expensive cars, and extraordinary art all add up to an image of a better life. But many are dissatisfied with this funding model. The artists argue that all the experimental and contemporary mediums are excluded from the Percent for Art program by its design. Many developers, in turn, find sculptures too static and explore ways how to make them alive. Some consider rotating art programs, in which they choose a strategic location for a pedestal and art pieces are changed every few months, rotating between different locations. Others look for sculptures that are more engaging and interactive, with embedded lights, sensors, and mechanisms. One art consultant put it bluntly: investors want art that's more like Burning Man, less like MoMA. Commissioning real estate art is a very formulaic process in which risks are mitigated and all stakeholders negotiate consensus. Such an approach works for development, which is all about risk, but it doesn't work for art, which is all about experimentation. Reduced to the role of cogs in a machine, real estate artists are paid little and often feel alienated by their jobs. The widespread consensus between all the actors leads to a censorship of sorts, which results with poor artistic quality. Although there are singular great examples of real estate art, as a rule, the system mechanically churns out unmemorable objects with little value. Knowing that the system doesn't deliver good results, many developers want to at least invest money into something practical. Gradually, art becomes architecture. The boundary between the two has become so thin that Oakland municipality specifically forbids the architect and the artist of a project to be the same person. The Vessel in New York is a sculpture so monumental that it actually became a building which had to be designed entirely by an architectural office. Its purpose is to enliven the Hudson Yards public plaza. The customers of the nearby shopping center walk up the sculpture and take pictures of themselves. The spectacle of their movement attracts more participants. But the enlivening is done without any particular program. Instead of increasing the traffic for commercial spaces, the vessel's functioning completely depends on the foot traffic of the shopping center. This example demonstrates that experimenting within the existing real estate art framework doesn't necessarily lead to meaningful new solutions. Professor Patrice Darrington traced the history of real estate development back to 17th century England. She noticed that early on the profession bifurcated into two disparate business models. Some developers built to hold, while others built to sell. Darrington argues that this fundamental divide until today is reflected in the way how developers approach design. If a development is built for the long term, it is made durable and sustainable. If for the short term, it's made spectacular to catch eye to increase sales. Real estate art today follows the short-term logic. The vessel is remarkably unsustainable. It will remain successful as long as people keep circulating out of the sheer need to take selfies. Covent Garden, the first real estate development project in history, built to hold, gives a hint how to harness art to create long-term value. It consists of three components: rental housing, a public plaza, and a parish church. The plaza is a space of social interactions and commerce. The operation of the temple is sustained by a small share of the monthly rent. All three spaces are integrated architecturally and economically. The Church of St. Paul, designed by none other than Inigo Jones, is well known for its remarkable facades in Tuscan order. But what's more intriguing is its section. It's a simple box, a vessel for the parish community and the mystery of transubstantiation. It's a perfect allegory of what real estate art could become. Instead of commissioning an art object, the developer would provide an art space for the professional art community, a simple box where art is created. Let these art spaces be integrated into the neighborhood, spatially, economically, and socially. The best way to do it is to recycle some of the ground floor retail spaces into art spaces. It is an open secret that ground floor retail didn't quite work, even before the pandemic. The ground floors have been increasingly dependent on gastronomy, but in the age of experiential retail, the lifespan of restaurants was getting shorter, while the upfront fixed costs remained high. While gastronomy, the engine of creative urbanism, was becoming an increasingly risky business, municipalities demanded more lively ground floors, leading to an oversupply of such spaces. This, in turn, led to commercial rents going down, vacancy rates going up, leases becoming shorter, and developers hastily converting retail spaces into live-work units. If the developers negotiated repurposing percent for art funds, from paying for sculptures to paying for rent of an art space, they would kill many birds with one stone. Decrease the risk of finding a retail tenant, support the local art community, and fund alternative forms of art. They would also start exploring forms of urban life beyond creative urbanism. Artists, the experts in challenging the status quo, have helped the developers many times in the past, having unintentionally invented lofts or urban farms. If professional artists are only given a chance to experiment, they will systematically rethink dysfunctional ground floors and propel them to the next era. In order to create a local art space, one has to build a program, which can take years, find a proper space, and run it, paying for the operating expenses. The Sullivan Community Space is an example how this can be organized. Oakland developer Neil Sullivan created a partnership with local nonprofits. He provides them with free space, they fill it with life. Let's imagine using his model to organize a hypothetical art space in Oakland. There are many nonprofits in the region that already have programs, audiences, and a great track record of artistic activity. This will take time is one of them. Founded by two Oakland-based artists, it runs an art residency in Point Arena. Its mission is to support underserved artists, people of color, women, queer and emerging artists. The remote location is a place where artists focus on work. Let's imagine creating the second public-facing venue where artists would showcase their work and engage with the public. I've made a financial simulation of such an investment. A hypothetical developer of a typical 100-unit building would provide a 3,000-foot art space, deed-restricted for 10 years, covering the lost rent by repurposing percent for art funds. The developer would pay for the operating expenses. These are negligible. And the nonprofit would have freedom to run the art program. And it would be rich. The residency would host around 200 artists a year. Solo and collaborative performance artists, working with movement, dance, and sound-based performances, creators of site-specific installations, new media artists, historian artists, archivists, and artists involved in all sorts of social practice and community engagement. Investing in local artists, the developer will gain political power. This is especially true in California, where art has a tradition of social practice and artists have proven to be powerful leaders. Becoming a patron of local art, the developer will build a reputation and will be able to garner goodwill with the next project in the area. But living art will also have a more direct impact on financials. Being local, contextual, and agile, it will be responsive to the surrounding reality. It will evolve together with the neighborhood and engage the community in a dialogue. A living art practice, integrated into the everyday life of the community, will increase rents very much like good amenity spaces do. Over time, it will also positively impact retention rates, more stability, and improve the tenant base. A flexible art space that supports local living art will affect long-term property value. Most obviously, it will effectively address the issues of equity by supporting the artists who are currently being forced out. For developers who look in the long term, lifting the community is always a good business strategy. Commissioning spectacular sculptures boosts sales in commercial spaces. My research suggests that living art affects residential units in the long term. Billions of dollars that developers pay for art every year is enough money to diversify investments into arts. Real estate developers should embrace their role of art patrons and pay more attention to how they fund art. Art has tremendous transformative power, and harnessing it for the sake of better cities is in everybody's best interest.